Welcome to a new episode of the Creative Industry Insight podcast. I'm your host, Bobby. Today, we welcome creator and writer Neil Forsyth, who joins us to talk about their work on Legends. Neil will talk us through his experience creating and writing the hit Netflix show. Please be warned, there are heavy spoilers in this episode. Now let's jump into the conversation with Neil. Hi Neil, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks very much for having me.
We're here to talk about Legends that's come out recently on Netflix. Before we sort of dive into the whole show, I think you're my first showrunner on the podcast, so it's quite exciting. And before we sort of jump into that, is it all right if you could just explain to the audience what a showrunner does? It's probably a lot of different things.
Yeah, I think it's quite a nebulous term, and there's a sort of American version of the job that is incredibly nuts and bolts, and there's sort of signing off micro budgets and personally hiring all sorts of people and things. But that's certainly not the kind of the norm in British television. I think what I am is a writer and creator who then works across the production full time, who's on the set probably 90% of the time, and if I'm not on the set, I'll be doing something else that's related to the show. And I guess it's sort of having some level of creative oversight, but it's a delicate situation, and you kind of have to recognize that, really, because it's about obviously working with brilliant people who have their own impact on the show in a very positive way, and rightly so. And it's just sort of balancing, giving people the space to kind of create and make an impact, but also sort of kind of reserving the right, really, to step in politely when you think that the show's maybe just slightly veering off track narratively, which is a very long answer because it's a strange role to define. I mean, there's days where, as a showrunner, you don't have to do anything, and there's days where it's 10 hours of trying to work out something really significant. It's completely unpredictable day to day, and it's kind of unpredictable show to show, really.
Yeah, I guess it's like with yourself, it's like you're like a traffic cop being like yes, no, but then also allowing people to do what they've been hired for as well.
Yeah, and you just get better at it the more experienced you are. You have to be willing to be surprised, certainly willing to recognize when something's been suggested that is an improvement on your script or how you saw something being executed, which I'm always very open to. But I think it's just about being hopefully a collegiate, friendly, polite person, but equally it is your job, and you are hired to have that creative oversight. So you do have to when you instinctively feel that, I think particularly story for me, that something has been suggested or has been planned that makes perfect sense in that area, in that technical area of the show, but I feel it impacts story. Then that's 90% of the time when I kind of will have a chat with people. It comes from me thinking that we're actually getting in the way of story a little bit, or we're doing something which might look visually fantastic and be a really smart idea, or from any department really, but it's just stepping on story, and we're losing a bit of clarity on the storytelling. So I think that's where it almost always comes from. So I've worked for 20 years to get to this position. I do think that writers and creators should be at the heart of the creative process right across the show. But first of all, some writers don't want to do that. Some writers don't want to even go to the set. They're happy to hand it over, and that's how they like to. They like the solitary act of writing more. They'd rather just move on to the next show. But I just want to see it all the way to its completion, really. And I think the big thing for me is I didn't have that role early in my career, and I think that I was very, very raw when I got into television, and I made lots of mistakes. But I did find occasionally there was things on productions where I felt they were missteps creatively, and I think that was the end result when those things got made, and kind of feeling a bit powerless to stop them, just not being part of that kind of key creative conversation. Sometimes I found really frustrating. So I always wanted to try and get to this position, and it's a lot of work, but it is very rewarding.
I guess as well, like because you're so deep into your writing as well, it's because you're there from literally day dot to then day zero, really, and everything in between of hurdles. It's basically like seeing your baby grow up from an idea to audiences talking about it online, and all the interviews and all the sort of conversations that you can have about it.
Yeah.
It must be so odd thinking like day one when you actually start doing your research and thinking about ideas to then people talking about those ideas and asking you questions about your writing or the story side of things. I guess as well, it must feel like you pinch yourself moment, because sometimes you never know how people will react to the show. And it kind of segues nicely to my next question, is like, how have you found the reaction to the show?
Reaction to Legends has been amazing. It's been, so positive, and I think what's been lovely is if you can get a very positive critical reaction and get the numbers as well and have a popular reaction, because I'm equally keen to have both. I kind of, it's lovely when you get a kind of majority of critical response is positive, and it feels, you do feel that you get that sort of little stamp of approval on that front. But I love making shows that have an impact, a popular impact. I think that I had that with the Gold, and definitely have had it with Legends. And I just think TV is important. I think it's a brilliant thing. It had a big effect on me when I was young. It's so accessible across societal classes and geographically and everything else, and it's just a great, for me, a great art form is scripted television. And so when you do it, I still get such a thrill of the idea of people watching it. And with the Gold, you had the idea of millions of people sitting down at the same time to watch something, as well as iPlayer, obviously. And then with Legends, it was that incredible thing of it being released in, I think it was 70 odd countries at once. It's I find that really kind of thrilling. So it's been brilliant. I would struggle, I think, to make, there's certain networks where you'll spend 2 years making a show and probably be well funded to do it, but when it comes out, it's it's just not that. They can dress it up any way they want. It's not being watched by many people, and I think I struggle with that a little bit, because I do think that I like having that popular impact. So it's been fantastic. Just in answer to your question before that about the day one to the end, I do think it is incredible. It's a sort of 2-year cycle for me making shows like this, from having the idea, starting doing the kind of tentative research with it, and that early part of the making a show is I keep it deliberately very small. Rhiannon is my story producer, my script editor, and I work with her early on, and how I'm kind of seeing the show, and that's just kind of more conversations at that point about what I think the show could be. And then I'll have Adam is the researcher I work with the most now, and he'll start digging around and getting the kind of information together. And I just keep it very small and very loose as I kind of work out what the show is. And then it's, the research process, the writing process, pre-production and casting and putting together the production and everything else, making the show, the production, post-production, so significant. I do so much work across the edit. The edit's the last writing process for me. And then publicity, which is sort of its own thing. So you've got all these stages making a show that ends up being with the release as well. You're talking about 2.5 years. And every stage is so different from the other. And it requires something different from me. And I think the the stage I still will always enjoy the most is that writing stage right at the beginning, because it still feels very solitary, still feels quite thrilling, can be very frustrating when you're trying to get a script to work, but it feels so pure, and then once you get into production, there's just so many other elements to kind of take into account. And a lot of my job in production is not necessarily particularly creative either. There's a lot of just sort of more sort of administration, really. So it's a big undertaking, and it is, it goes from day one in my office, me thinking an idea, and then the last day it's always me in a small sound booth in Soho, looking at one last tiny minutiae thing with the sound engineer, and then, saying, all right, mate, see you next time, and walking off home and getting the tube. It's a funny, it starts, it starts and finishes in these very low key ways, but in the middle of it, you'll have this huge production.
I just find because the idea of it, people think like the glitz and the glamour of it is actually just like, at the end of the day, we finished it. I take the tube home, and maybe open a beer or something, just because I know I've finished and now I can relax. But then even going back to like the writing process and having such a small team, even probably you're also tight knit because you know what you're going to be looking for and what your story want to be told, because Legends is based on a book, so you can have that advantage of like having that source material, but then I guess the source material is your foundation, and then you can just sprout out wherever you sort of want to go during that time period as well.
Yeah, I mean, Legends is sort of we optioned Guy's book. He was Tom Burke's character, which was an interesting starting point for that character, in terms of sort of some source material. But the show's not technically based on it. It was certainly a big part of the research, but I mean, we then did a huge amount of research ourselves, and we go into lots of worlds that are not touched on in the book. So I think it's about that starting point. So the starting point was absolutely Guy. We got introduced by Guy, by great producer Liz, who worked on speaking. Originally looked at it as potentially as a documentary, and then we came and made it as a drama. And we got introduced and had this lovely kind of lunch, and he was just an intriguing character. So then what you do then is you option the book that tells a very singular story with him. So you've kind of, you've got that as a starting point. And then it's right, well, how do I open this up? So first of all, he introduced me to some of the other legends. Then Adam, my researcher, would throw up all these other worlds that Customs worked in. And I'd look at that, and I'd look at that with Rhiannon, my story producer, and we'd work out how these worlds could fit together and how it could go into a show. So the big thing for me is just pulling in as much research as I possibly can, and you end up with this vast document. And it's intimidating in some ways because it's so sprawling, but equally it's kind of exciting because I know that the show is within that document, and I just need to kind of work it out and find it and finesse it and composite it and everything else. And I kind of like that part of the process. It can be really exciting with research when it throws up something and you immediately know that's going to end up in the show. And having written fiction in the past, when I wrote Guilt, which was a fictional drama, I found that very, very hard. I found it very difficult. I call it the sort of tyranny of possibility, where if anything can happen, how do you choose what's going to happen, and how do you not immediately doubt your choices in terms of, God, if I just kept thinking about there'd be a better option for that part of the plot. I find that very difficult. I do find it easier working off stories that are inspired by true stories. It's still largely a lot of the process is still the same in terms of dramatization. Obviously, all the dialogue you're still coming up with, and the voice and the relationships, but you do have that safety net, if you like, of having that hard narrative behind it. So it's definitely a different thing from writing fictional drama, but it much of the same kind of tools and moves that you pull as a writer.
And I guess with like if you're creating something from scratch rather than pulling from sort of real life, your character decisions and choices in episode 2 might affect what you do in 6, or vice versa, and then you sort of have to go back and rewrite. And I can imagine that can be kind of stressful, but then also having it on your wall of like, how how do we get to A to B without accidentally going to C when we should be somewhere else?
Yeah, I think they kind of, I mean, what I've got kind of better at is recognizing the importance of structure. That when earlier in my career, I would work on it, but I would do it in quite a, I'd be so itching to get to the script stage that I'd come up with all these reasons of why I should just crack on with the script. And I was like, I want to still feel a bit of freedom and all these things. But really, it's just really, really hard structuring a complicated television drama. And I wasn't as good as it then. And I shirked it a little bit and kind of went into the writing a bit quick sometimes. And that's just so counterproductive, because what you end up doing is having to unpick it later. And the whole process will actually take you longer. Whereas what I've realized is the longer I spend in structure, when I get to writing the script, it's just fun. I enjoy it because I can relax. I can just relax and enjoy the dialogue because I know the structure works. But, Guilt, for example, it was hard to fully structure. It was such a complicated story, and I wanted to, there is a little element, without sounding pretentious, that sometimes it is nice to let the character guide you a little bit, set up a situation and see how the character reacts, and that can push you into a new story. And that's just knowing your characters. But it was a kind of high wire act, because often, as you say, I'd come up with a nice twist, but then to make that twist make sense, I had to do various other things. And I always remember with the last episode of Guilt, every series, the last episode, because along the way, if I hit a problem, I often would come up with a solution that was pushing someone into a new world or revealing a hitherto unknown connection or some sort of twist. All you're really doing is setting up more and more issues you need to sort out at the end when you try to tie the whole thing together. So I always thought when I got to the last episode of Guilt, it was a bit like being a bouncer at a pub, and everyone that you've barred turns up at once, and you're thinking, oh fucking hell, I forgot about him and her. So it's trying to make that make sense was a challenge. So that is the great thing with the true story, is that you do know where the story's going, and it's about finding the nuance and surprise along the way.
That's such a good analogy. It's so good. That really tickled me. But I think as well with the two as well, because with Legends, it does feel like a mini series, and it's very, very lean. There's no fat on it, and I feel like the best way I could ever describe it, I'm not sure if you've ever heard it, but have you ever heard of like the surfing Dracula an analogy? So basically, somebody tweeted out saying, like, back in the day, if you did a TV show called Surf Dracula, you'd see the full surfing every week in New Adventures. But in streaming era, the entire first season has got to be a long ass flashback to how he got the surfboard until you finally get to see him surf for 5 minutes in finale. And I feel it's like, and I feel like Legends is basically that analogy of like the first part of it, like seeing the legends be legends, because it's literally the first, I would say, 30 to 40 minutes. You see what they can do. You can see this, what they specialize in, and then boom, we throw them straight in the deep end, rather than spending a whole first season training them to be legends, and then they're like, okay, we're ready to go into the field. When it comes to writing something like that, where it's so sort of fast moving, fast paced, and you're, as audiences, you're accepting these characters as they are, which in a way they're legends themselves because of like actor wise. How do you go about creating that structure and thinking about moving the story so quickly forward, rather than letting it breathe?
Well, there's a few things. Firstly, I think you pull people in through story, and you get them to stay through character. I think that's a really important way to look at certainly the shows I write, and frankly the shows I admire. And I think you have to pull people in, and one of the many ways to do that is through pace. I also just find it exciting. I like writing with pace. I like pacey stories, and like you say, trimming out the fat, making sure everything's justified and everything's needed. And I do think about the audience, and I think about why are they still watching after 10 minutes? Because that's how I view a lot of television drama. You know, I watch dramas and nothing's happened after half an hour other than, you know, this sort of slightly indulgent, heavy characterization, or it's all about the visual. And these are all kind of, for me, weak substitutes for story. I think that I always remember reading an interview with Keith Richards, and he said, if you've got a great opening riff, you catch half of them, and if you've got great opening chorus, you get the other half. And I think it's true. I think it's people should be yanked into a story. And I think that for me as the writer, that's what I find exciting to write. How can I simplify this even further? How can I make it even quicker? And then you justify those character moments later. You know, that's the thing, is that you, as I say, pulling people in through story, getting them engaged, getting them involved, means that you then buy their attention down the line, where quite rightly later in the story, you start to unpeel your characters and explain them further. And that's the natural order of things, and that's how it should happen. Because I think that if you start, and I was guilty of this earlier in my career, if you start launching into lengthy character moments early in your story, you know, people don't care. It's like going to a party and you get introduced by someone, they say, let me tell you about my childhood. It's a disaster. You know, you just want to try and get out as quickly as possible. So, you know, you need to pull them in narratively and get them excited. And then when you have your character moments, the audience cares more, because they've gone on a bit of adventure with these people and they want to understand them more, and they want to understand some of the decisions that they've seen them make, rather than explain the character before those decisions are even made, if that makes sense. So getting that order right of story and character is very important, and a big part of that, the kind of positive effect of that, is just really leaning into the pace, particularly early on.
Yes, and I think as well, like it sets up moments. I think there's moments that sets up for characters that reward the audiences, so that you can feel tension, or you feel the understanding between the characters and like why they're doing it. And I think you see that in episode 6 with Tom Burke's character, whose name escapes me right now, with his being on the tube with his family, and how it's sort of like the legend life has caught up to him. Then even the moment where with Hakan, when he ends up running into Zeki's family home, it's like those sort of moments as well, that like I feel like as audiences you're rewarded, and you kind of have either people get their comeuppances, or it just amps up the tension as well.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, the guy on the tube, that's a great example of how rewarding research can be. So the incident with Guy and his family, Tom Burke's character on the tube, that comes up in the final episode, that's based on a true story, and that's based on a story that Guy never told publicly before. But it was, you know, I was going around to Guy's house regularly, speaking to him and his wife about their experiences. And I always think with these processes, and having gone through it a few times now in different shows, I feel like the first conversation you have with people when you're researching a true story, they'll tell you all the anecdotes they've told before. And the second time, you can get into it a little bit more. And I always think it's usually the third conversation when they've sort of run out of those anecdotes. And that's when you start to get to the kind of deeper material in terms of what their experiences really did to them emotionally, and they can be a bit more reflective on the whole process. And it was a completely throwaway comment Guy made, I think as I was leaving his house one day. He just said, I think I was talking about his family and the impact. He said, well, you know, the biggest time was this thing in the tube. And he kind of threw it out to me, I think, standing in the corridor of his house. And that just went, that was an example of me rushing to my car, making lots of notes on the phone, getting home, sticking it into final draft. And that scene went very cleanly into the show and was a big integral scene in the end. So it's really thrilling when you kind of come across those moments.
I think as well, like it must be, as you said, it's just a throwaway comment, but it's so integral in episode 6 and how worlds collide, and also the fact that like you're stuck on the tube, so there's nowhere to run. if you've ever taken the tube as well, if it's during rush hour or certain points of the day. I think then it's also during sort of school holidays, so it'll be busier with different all types of people, and so it just adds even more to the tension and kind of stuck there. So then you kind of have to, and how it plays out, it's just it's perfect.
Yeah, and it's a good example of production as well, because that was expensive for what it was, and this is a good example of how you use your money smartly in a production, because that would have been a fairly significant saving if we stuck that on a bus, for example. But you just lose a vast amount of attention, and it just doesn't kind of work. So that's a good example of, every show you ever make, you're up against it in a budgetary sense. So that was an example of looking at the episode and me saying, well, look, I do feel that we need to keep that tube scene, so I'll make this sacrifice elsewhere, and sort of shuffling the money about a little bit. But I think you can see in the end result, just I'm so glad that we did that. It was brilliantly executed by director and his crew, and I think it was great performances. Yeah, a really powerful moment.
Yeah, and I think potentially one of my favourite scenes of the series. But there's something that you mentioned earlier, and that was when you're meeting with other legends and talking to them. How do you go about making them feel comfortable in them talking to you, but then also not showing any sort of fear when talking to them as well? Because they are people that have seen like some real life stuff and have been put into like really dangerous situations. Is there an element of fear when you're talking to them, or is it a case of just like having a normal conversation like you would with a friend down at the pub?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, I started as a journalist, which I'd kind of put in inverted commas because I had no qualifications, and I worked in a pub in Edinburgh for many years while starting to get little bits of writing work, and I used to do a lot of work for the men's magazines back then, Maxim and FHM and Front and all these kind of lads mags. But I would do a lot of stories around criminality and interesting feature writing and going off on these sort of adventures. So I interviewed a lot of interesting and often intimidating characters back then. So I think I probably got a lot of my kind of nerves out the way at that stage, if you like. And I went to prisons and all over the world. I went and I remember doing an undercover article where I went into a prison in India and kind of almost sneaked in to try and do a story about this British kid that had been very harshly imprisoned. And so I had all these adventures as in the kind of late 20s that, looking back now, I'm surprised how kind of up for it I was. I wouldn't do half of that stuff now, but with having a little bit more responsibility and being a bit slower on my feet as well. So I kind of, I think I got a lot of that stuff out my system and concentrated, being able to relax and say, no, I'm here to tell a story, and people are people, and as long as you're kind of honest and respectful, you end up having a conversation with them. And I think I think the other thing in terms of making them feel comfortable, what helps now is having made other shows, obviously, so they can look at the gold and see how I tell a story that's based on true events. And some of them might have an issue with that, and that's not a problem. If they, for whatever reason, choose not to be involved and not to speak to me, that's never an issue. I'd rather just know that up front so I can take that into narrative decisions and putting the show together. But equally, I think they recognise that. I think they also recognise that I put the work in. I mean, that's the thing, is like, when I do interview people, I'm very well prepared, and I'm not turning up on a whim. And I think they're often surprised with how much preparation we've done and how much research, and they can see that we are taking it seriously. And then the final thing I'd say is that with all these shows, for me, it's about recognising the really, really sensitive areas. So in The Gold, for example, there was a couple of killings, and immediately recognised that how sensitive they were going to be, and sought out family members who would be affected by us betraying these events, and took guidance from them and how they would like those things to be presented, or what they would like to be omitted from the process visually. And without kind of going into that in a great detail, I made very significant narrative decisions in The Gold to protect innocent people who'd been affected by those events, and that's all invisible. You never talk about that publicly or specifically or anything, but showing that responsibility is very important. And I think that the legends, I mean, it's an interesting situation with legends because often when you do a true story, people want to know if they're going to be represented in the show. But with the legends, they didn't want their names to be used in the show. They couldn't be because of their past. They're all still very careful people, how they go about their lives. So that's quite a unique situation where I sometimes occasionally had to do little things to make sure they weren't too identifiable for kind of security reasons. So there's all sorts of elements that go into how you tell these stories. But I think the biggest thing is people can recognize when you're putting the work in and you're taking it seriously and responsibly, and it's not kind of fly by night approach to the research.
I feel like you can make a TV show of your earlier work if you're talking about all these things, breaking into an Indian prison and some of these interviews. It feels like we can do an action version of Almost Famous in a way.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing. I've got an amazing folder of all those things I did. I mean, unfortunately, I also used to go and do sort of what at the time were humorous stories, with sort of iconic British television characters from the 70s, 80s, but unfortunately half of them have since been disgraced. I can't dwell on that too much, but it was really exciting. I'd find a little story, a snippet from a newspaper often, and I'd think there was more to it, and I'd get in touch with people. Then I'd phone up my magazine editors and say, do you fancy this? And they'd say, yeah, go for it. And I'd jump on a train to wherever it was in the UK, meet a photographer, go off and do the story, write it up in the train home. It was brilliant. It was very sort of nimble storytelling. I think it really helped me in my later career in certain ways. Well, what we were talking about earlier, trying to be efficient in your storytelling. If you get 3,000 words for an article and you're trying to tell this big sprawling story, the big thing is wrestling it down to that 3,000 words. I used to do football match reports for Scottish newspapers when I'd get 300 or 400 words to tell the story of a football game, and that was an incredible discipline because every word has to count, and that it really does make you scrutinize your writing in a really valuable way. And also you had to file the match report 15 minutes after the final whistle, so if there's a last minute goal, you've got to run through your report and rewrite it in certain ways, and then phone in the report from the press box. It was I loved it. I loved all of it. It was just great, pure storytelling in lots of different forms, and it definitely gave me all sorts of tools in later life. Pitching stories, for example, when you've got 30 seconds to phone a magazine editor in London and try and get them engaged with something, you have to have that quick pitch sort of ready to go. So I think it helped me a lot.
I think as well, like I love football, and I know somebody who would go to different games in the EFL, and they would have to do the sort of highlight snipping for, I think it was Quest at the time. I think the rights move around a lot, but they were saying, yeah, you have to cut down a 90-minute game into like 90 seconds or 2 minutes. There's nothing worse than like it's two halves being absolutely dire and somehow having to make up the chances when there's been like no shots and goals, very few corners and like that. I can imagine it's the same with you as well when you're writing these things, thinking, what's another word for it wasn't a very eventful game?
Yeah, I mean, I remember doing a very early match where there was a team that was 1-0 up, and it was deep into injury time. So I'd written my match report very much following the thread of this team being dominant. And the other team, I think it was Ross County St Mirren, the other team scored 2 goals in injury time to win the game. And I was completely screwed. My whole report, and I was like, oh my God, so frantically rewriting. And I remember this old reporter watching me, and then after I phoned it in, he said, listen, son, what you do is you write the first paragraph last. So what he would do is he'd write the report of the game in a fairly neutral way, just what happened. So, and then at the final whistle, he'd then write his big first paragraph, which would summarize the winning team and how they did it and the themes. And once you've established your narrative, taken it in that first paragraph, the rest of the story just made sense within it. So those kind of tricks you learn. But equally, I always remember, and talking about perhaps recognise the value of research later in my career. I remember writing a match report. I went to do the Scotsman for Livingston were playing, and I went out there, and Livingston had just bought a player that morning, David Fernandes, and I'd read something or I'd heard someone talking about this French player, and I thought, great, that's Fernandes. So they won 1-0 and Fernandes scored the goal. And I said in my report, it was finished with typical Gallic style by the Frenchman. Anyway, I got the paper the next day and I read it, and it's got to the bit about the goal, and the sub-editor had obviously been in, and it said that it was a neat finish from the Spaniard, right? And I was thinking, oh, fucking hell, I've got that could be it. That could be me sunk. I just obviously got they'd obviously picked it up on the sports desk. So anyway, I was waiting, and then you had to phone up an authority to see if you're getting allotted a game. So I very nervously phoned up and asked for the sports deputy head that allotted the games, this very kind of gruff Scottish man. And anyway, phone rang, and I was waiting nervously, and he picked up the phone and he just said, bonjour. And yeah, then he then just gave me the game. It was sort of like, bonjour, right, Stenhousemuir Albion Rovers, 400 words, hung up, and I was back in the system. So it was a great discipline. I absolutely loved it. And, it was when I was working as a freelance journalist that I found the story of Elliot Castro, who was a young Scottish credit card fraudster. And I read about his conviction in the Scottish newspaper and wrote to him and tracked him down in Ford Open Prison in Sussex, and ended up going down to the open prison, taking him out for the day, interviewing him. That became an article in Maxim magazine. That then became my first book and took me into kind of writing longer form stuff. So it was all the kind of pieces of my career join up like that.
Yeah, it's just funny how the stars align in those sort of ways. It's the same with like The Gold and the book coming out from that, having that as well, because I read the book on that once I saw the series, and that was like sort of really interesting to read, because there's stuff like those parts of history where you don't know about it so much, and also being of a certain age, it was before my time, so it's like a really interesting way to sort of step back and sort of look at these people, and then also like the terms, like there were proper villains and like that sort of terminology about them.
Yeah, The Gold was, it was a kind of, it was a famous crime, but an unknown story, and I think that's very attractive, because people would sort of feel that they'd recognise the bare bones of the story and they'd be sort of intrigued by it, but then what you're then telling is this vast, sprawling, almost entirely unknown story behind it. I mean, there'd obviously been books on it and documentaries and bits of the story, but I don't think anyone had ever pulled it together the way we pulled it together. And that's one of the reasons we did the book, because Thomas Turner, who did a great job researching the first series of The Gold, we just had this vast trove of documents. And there was a period, without doubt, where Thomas and I knew more about the Brinksmat story than anyone in history, without doubt, while we were writing that book, because people would know more about different areas of it than us. But in terms of the whole world, the whole canvas on it, and a lot of that's gone out of my head now. I mean, because you can't. It's like cramming for an exam. You can't kind of hold it together. But that was part of the reason I said to Thomas, "You got to try and lay this out in a book, because I don't think it's ever been pulled together in quite the same way narratively." The great thing with the Gold research was Brian Boyce, the Hugh Bonneville played. There was times where I'd go down and see Brian, and I saw him dozens of times. I'd go down to Brian's house, and it got to the point where I could tell him things about the story that he didn't know, and he led the investigation, and he would say, "Oh, that's that's really interesting," and I'd show him some of the documents we'd found, and so I'm glad it went well for lots of reasons, but one of them is because we put a huge amount of work into that show just to get it right and to uncover things. And there's storylines in The Gold that have come from newspaper archive hunts that we did, tiny little articles we discovered. There's a tiny piece in the London Evening Standard that we found that was about the Cornish tin mines and the suggestion that gold had been hidden down there, and that became a whole opening part of series 2. That came from a 2-paragraph story in the Evening Standard. So I found a throwaway comment in a book that one of the criminals, it was suspected that he was moving gold using a decommissioned ambulance. That became a whole storyline. So it's, you put the work in and the story will emerge.
I think that those sort of moments as well, like when you're watching it, they're sort of, even though they come from newspaper articles and throwaway sort of lines, it's crazy to think that actually is real and somebody was doing that. And there's also the audacity to pull it off, even the heist, but then also moving gold in a disused ambulance. Yeah, it's crazy. And I was gonna say, I was gonna ask, like, would the gold be your mastermind like topic of choice? But now that you mentioned it, it's all gone out of your head. It might not be the best one to choose.
Yeah, I would have absolutely nailed it about 2 years ago, but now I'd be scrabbling about in the index of my own book to try and remember what happened. It's they're so complicated, these stories, and I think often it's hard even with publicity. If a network sits on a show for too long before putting it out, the time it comes out, I need to almost refresh myself, because I'll usually by that point I'll be in the midst of writing something new. So I have to kind of refresh my knowledge in order to publicize the show. But it's, I think what I was very lucky with the Gold and Legends is being able to tell a story that is inspired by real events, but is so complicated and unexpected and sprawling that it gives you that canvas to write, 2 series of television. And it's very unusual with true stories, because true stories that you get pitched as a writer are often really interesting, but 3 or 4 things really happen when you boil it down. And most true stories you get pitched would be great films, but in terms of a pacey television series that uses up a lot of story, they just don't work. They run out of story. And I think that's why you get some TV series that are inspired by real events, and they're just strange beasts in the end, because they don't have enough story, but they're so locked into telling the truth of it, they don't want to go overboard with creative license. So what they end up doing is making a dramatic series out of a story that doesn't have enough dramatic beats. And so they kind of retrospectively say, oh, it's all about character and tone and other themes, but you end up with something that's a bit underwhelming, I think. So you need something really meaty. You need a story where so many things happen that you're going to have the job of deciding what to leave out, which is very important. And there's not many of them around, really. So I was very lucky to go from the Gold to Legends. And I don't think there's not that many more stories out there that have that kind of depth and nuance, I don't think.
I don't know. I think it depends on if stuff is like under lock and key by the government as well. That like
that's true.
There's stuff that we don't know about. It's like, I think something that pops into my mind is something like The Bank Job. I don't know if you've seen that. It's a film from 2008 with Jason Statham about they basically break into a bank to steal all the money, but there also is like photos. I think it's one of the royals.
Yeah, it's a famous story with Princess Margaret.
Yeah.
That I know that one. I mean, I think it is. What I should clarify is what I meant is there's probably not that many more stories like that on my desk because I've not found them. But I think the other thing with a true story is you want to feel that you are. There's the events themselves and the characters involved, but what is the wider world that is? What's exciting about that wider world? What is interesting and unique about that point in history as well, and how does that fold into your story? So all that stuff helps a lot. I mean, the period of it is interesting as well. I didn't after the goal, I didn't intend to write another early 90s set multi-strand crime drama, which is what I then did on a fundamental basis with Legends. But I think partly the reason is I do really like writing in the pre-digital age. I think it's more interesting dramatically. It's kind of old school. People need to get out there, out and about. There's much more mystery and intrigue because it's hard to trace people and track them down. And like with the Legends, for example, that department at Customs no longer exists. And I do think one of the reasons is, in a contemporary sense, having these alter egos and these legends that they play when they go undercover, I think it's much, much harder. How do you convince someone in the digital age that you are a 42-year-old man with a whole different life and backgrounds when they could look online and say, well, there's no trace of your life here. You know, where's your teenage Facebook account, or where's photos of your wedding and so on. So, and for lots of reasons, the pre-digital age, I think, is much more exciting for me dramatically, and I do think probably that's where I'll stay.
I think as well, like it has to make you feel a lot more. You have to probably think a lot more about how story works, and try to be clever in the way it's portraying. You're right in terms of like, if you were to do it now, somebody would say, yeah, what about your embarrassing photos on Facebook? As you said, wedding. There's all these sort of moments where we capture so much, and so much gets uploaded on each like different platforms, that you somehow have to create that whole world. And then also, I think you can just tell if something's AI or slightly off with like Photoshop as well, unless you're really, really, really good on it.
Yeah, and I think also the investigative side, you know, whether it's police or customs or anyone like that, any sort of contemporary investigation is so technologically led. It's incredibly dull to watch. You know, I can't handle the idea of writing a contemporary investigative show where everyone stands around a computer discussing what they've just learned on the computer. You know, it's not, it's kind of just not for me. I don't find it interesting. So it does sadly mean I probably need to stay largely pre-1998.
Yeah, but I guess also, I guess with like tech as well, it's like there are certain exciting ways, but then also, as you said, like sitting at a computer, also the reality of it, like if you were actually doing it in real life, it's probably quite slow and monotonous. And it's like, how do you make it exciting in the real world?
Yeah, or you ignore it. I mean, Guilt was very interesting because on the face of it, Guilt's a contemporary show, but it sort of existed in its own world. You know, I think, you know, there's probably 3 text messages in 3 series, and you know, but I can't remember seeing anyone sort of at a computer, because I just try to keep driving it through the kind of the character and story. But I think, you know, what I would say is I think there's people that make contemporary dramas that kind of really embrace the technological stuff, and they do it brilliantly. It's just not the way I want to kind of go about telling a story, I suppose.
Yeah, exactly. And each to their own. And, you know, you make it work. So I don't think anyone can complain. I've got I think I've got 4 questions left, if that's all right. I really want to talk about casting, because the casting of the show, I feel like it's really nailed on. And I can imagine that when you're in the process, you have an idea written down, but then once you get actors coming in, those ideas slightly change, and then actors could bring something slightly different because they're bringing words to life rather than you're in a monologue, like rereading it. How did you go about with the casting and thinking of names? Did you already have people in mind, or did you let the casting director sort of lead you more down an alley of like, these are the sort of people that you want to be looking at?
It's kind of, I mean, there's such a broad spectrum of casting, from the straight up offer to someone who is going to help you get the show made, as well as being a brilliant actor. They have that kind of profile. You're so keen to get them, you just want to get ahead of yourself. You go to them quite early in the process, perhaps. Right through to the part where you're starting to really panic. You're 2 days from the read through. You've watched 20, 30 tapes. You've done callbacks with 10 actors. You've still not found it. And you're sitting there with the casting director and the director and producers and everyone else and sort of panicking. So there's a broad spectrum. And in terms of, you know, that very rarely there'll be parts when I'm writing the show where I just very strongly feel I can picture the actors should play that. It'll happen a few times probably with each production, and I'll often not get that person for various reasons, but it's often been very helpful for me just as a writing process to have a voice in my head. It's helped me kind of sharpen who the character is, perhaps. But I mean, specifically with Legends, I did think about Tom Burke very early for Guy. Big admirer of Tom, but I never worked with him, never met him. We got a lot of mutual friends, but I hadn't met him. But I did think about him early. Coogan was fairly early in the process. His name kind of popped up as a possibility for Don, and just made a lot of sense, I think, for all of us. It was just exciting, and it felt really interesting casting. It's always lovely to cast someone to do something slightly different than what you've seen them do before. And then some of the others were suggestions from, Livy, Scott Webb, and Diane and Simon are a great team, a great kind of casting team, or directors, Brady and Julian, producers, Ben and Rhiannon and everyone across all the tapes, and just a kind of collegiate group conversation of suggestions, and then being surprised and excited by tapes that came in, and then the callback editions. And you just never really, I think for me as the creator, it's about also being open to an edition coming in that is different to how I saw the character, but different in a really exciting way. And then I think the other big challenge in casting these shows is they are big ensemble shows. So it's kind of, there's two things that you're trying to line up really. Is this the right actor for the part? But is it also the right actor for the ensemble? Are they bringing in performance something that's going to feel unique and have its own space in the kind of dramatic whole? So juggling those two things together can be counterintuitive sometimes. So you've just got to try and have the whole thing in your head, and work hard. The other thing is work hard. We don't, all of us involved in casting these shows, we just keep going unless we really, really feel we nailed it. We will just keep going, and we do go down to the wire without doubt on parts every show. They've got big cast, these shows, the Gold and Legends, and you're always going down to the wire and trying to fill those gaps. But equally, what I do try and do is I try to be really respectful of the actors, because I find it so impressive the way that they come in so prepared and they've thought about it, and that just the challenge of coming into these really sterile casting rooms and trying to conjure up a performance. I'm so kind of in awe of them. So if someone does a brilliant audition for a part, but it's just not right for the character, I will always try, and we always have a list of great auditions we've had, but for the wrong part, and we try and move those people to other parts. I do that a lot in the shows. And then, having made a lot of television now, there is actors that have been in 2 or 3 of my shows. And again, I think that's a good thing. I think if you work with great people, then if you then have another show in a part where they pop into your mind, then I think, I don't want to have a sort of big traveling company between shows, but I think there's probably in every show I make now, you'll find half a dozen actors that I've worked with before. And I find that quite comforting as well, because I'm so comfortable with how they work, and I know that part, exactly how that's going to be the process there, and I kind of can relax and think about other areas.
It's funny how in the day of streaming that you still need that sort of like air quotes big name to help you get off the ground. I feel like that's something that's sort of, it feels like it's been around for ages to get projects going.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. What I do is I really concentrate on creating the show with, as I said earlier, as few people involved as possible. I think to try and have that sort of clarity of thought. So we don't tend to speak to directors, for example, until the show's commissioned, and the show is almost entirely written, because I think that's usually the most useful way to do it, because then you're showing people the whole world and they're pitching on the whole take on it. I don't think I've ever approached an actor before the show's commissioned and the whole thing's written as well. So it's making that collaborative part of the process as kind of late as possible, once we all know it's happening, I think is really important to me. I guess it's because I just want to, I'm a solitary writer. I write every word myself. I don't have a writer's room. And I just like to keep the process as focused and solitary, as well as people like Rhiannon and the editing front, and Ben, my producing partner, and Adam, my researcher, but a real core team until as late in the process as possible. So yes, I don't think I've never had a network say, well, we'll make this if you can get a big star, for example. They've always commissioned the show based on the scripts, and then you go and cast it. And of course, part of that casting conversation will be delivering quality plus some profile. I mean, that's all the networks are the same on that front. But it's never hinged on the casting, the commissioning decision. I've never got a big film star in the development stage. I never brought a director on early. I don't really. I know that some shows are made like that, and I can understand why, but it's not the way we go about it. It has to be driven by the story, and then people come on board. Equally, I've worked with some very significant actors, great profiles, and they've been brilliant to work with. And they've come in as part of an ensemble and kind of, rolled their sleeves up and been part of the team and recognize that we're making something that's not a kind of huge lead one actor on the poster thing. It is a team effort and a story that we're all working on together. And it's worked really, really well. I think there's an area of sort of international television drama that is financially at a different level than the shows I make, even though, I work in kind of a good quality stuff that's well funded. But there's an area of international television drama that's extremely expensive, where they'll have film stars that come to do some television and get an exec producer credits, usually 2 or 3 of them. They'll often bring a kind of bona fide film director on board, who will then come in a very significant creative position. And I think the end result of that, because there's only one creative pie, if you like, with each television show that needs to be shared out. But the end result of that is the writer and the creator get squeezed out, and they play a kind of secondary role creatively to these big stars and this big film director. And people say, well, I would say that. I'm obviously a member of the writers' mafia, if you like, but I think that's creatively misguided, and it's not an area of television that I have any interest to work in whatsoever, because the idea of the creator being sort of elbowed out by these other parts of the process, I just think is wrong. And I just think what you end up with in the vast majority of the time of these shows is something that doesn't have that really militant creative voice running through it, because there's too many influences and that are often dwarfing the voice of the writer. So I'm very happy with the sort of financial level I'm at, if you like, because I've never had a network say, go and get a huge star and we'll make the show. They've always commissioned the show and then you go off and cast it.
Yeah, that's interesting to hear, because there's, I think sometimes people forget that even though you're making a TV show or film, even though it's like an artistic venture, there's also like a lot of money and risk behind it. And there's obviously people, in air quotes, the suits, being, quite worried about it and making sure that if you're going to make it, how are we going to be able to market it, and who would be like the person that you put on the poster or so on and so forth. I think
that's true, Robert. The one thing I'd say is I do think that by and large, certainly everyone I've worked with, they do trust storytelling. And I think that, I think sometimes it's a little bit unfairly categorized of that being the kind of prominent thought of these networks. Now, look, there's networks I've not worked with where it might be more elevated, but I think that kind of slight marketing feel is always going to be part of a commissioning decision. But I do think we do have a very laudable tradition in British television where storytelling is still, hopefully, the main prize, in terms of, we think good stories connect with people, and this is a good story. And of course, there's those more pragmatic conversations on top of that. But I think, although in defense of your point, I think it does conflate with what I said earlier. I think that very, very expensive television is probably dying down a bit now, but was kind of brought in by the streamers. That is absolutely becomes much more of a conversation of, well, if we're going to spend this vast amount of money, we need to have these huge names faces to stick in the poster, and arguably put a film director on it to give it the big cinematic feel we think it needs to, which again, I would probably dispute, but yes, I think it is part of it there. So again, I think it's recognizing the different strata of television and the way that they're viewed.
Yeah, I would love to wonder what it'd be like to have to be in a room between like the two as well. Like the conversations of like if it's just story or if it's like star driven and whatnot. Yeah, it's just a fascinating process, really. But then, as you said, I bet you every project's so different in a way that you kind of have to juggle so much and understand it as well.
Yeah, and I think where they get in trouble is they just don't value the writer and the writing enough. And I think there is I think probably one or two networks where the writer is seen as, you know, ultimately disposable. There's big stories about these big dramas where the writer's been sort of managed out the process, that maybe the star's given so many thoughts and story and scripts that the writers reach their limit in terms of what they can accommodate, and the end result of that is the writer moving on. And that's happened, you know, with some of these big shows in the last few years. And I, you know, again, obviously from the point of view of very much being a loyalist to the writing community, I think it's outrageous and creatively misguided. I think you see that with the end result when it makes it to the screen.
Yeah, I think it's like I get people have, you know, when let's say an actor gets into their character and they want to add to it certain little things because they've developed it and there's been conversations. But then when you hear people just like take over completely, I think it's just crazy, because it's like, how can you justify doing something like that? And then I guess that's all to do with ego and wanting it to be all me sort of thing.
Yeah, but I think it's just become overly empowered. You know, the caveat to all that is actors have a fantastic understanding of their characters, and an actor's input on that front is hugely helpful as part of the kind of overall process. Same with, obviously, with directors, and you know, HODs in all sorts of area. You know, it's brilliant when people buy in and put in the work and take that real interest and go the extra mile and have all sorts of ideas that really elevate the scripts. It's really exciting, but equally that has to be part of that kind of collegiate conversation, and the writer and creator needs to be right at the heart of these decisions. And I do think in the shows where the writer and creator is taken out of that kind of key creative unit at the heart of the show, I definitely think it's always to the cost of the end creative result.
Yeah, and I think then also leads to, if the show wants to go on for more seasons, how do you then sort of rectify the issue as well?
Well, honestly, some of these places will think, well, we'll just get other writers in, you know. And anyway, I must avoid going on too much of a rant.
No,
but, yeah.
That's fine. We can. I've got I've got a few more questions. So I think for my third and final question, what was your favorite scene to write?
In Legends,
Yes.
there's a scene between Guy and Dawn in episode 3, sitting in Guy's garden. It was a sort of, I think it was the longest scene in the show. I think it's about 4 pages where we kind of uncover their backstory. And I just think that is, I think it was, the performances are just two powerhouses, Tom and Steve, in that scene. Beautifully shot, Brady Hood and his team in the opening block director. I just remembered shooting it that night. I remember going over to a house over the roads where they had a little green room and running the lines with Steve and Tom, and they just had it. You know, for the first time we read through, I was like, God, this is so powerful. You can tell when an actor's been holding a scene in his head for weeks and working towards it, and way beyond just knowing the material, you know. And we didn't have much time, and so you had that sort of adrenaline of the pressure, and I just remember being behind the monitors watching it and thinking, God, they've just really landed that. It's fantastic, and it felt so real. And Tom Burke is so brilliant in that scene. And I remember, you know, encouraging Tom to let himself go to maybe a slightly more emotional place than he was necessarily going to when I was chatting to him sort of in between takes. And I think it felt very warranted. And Steve was brilliant. Steve was just so still. So I just thought that was I just remember driving home after that, late at night and just being excited and thinking, God, that just felt powerful. It's so rewarding when you have those moments on a production, which is hard work in lots of ways. But when you have those moments of just pure creative collegiate joy, that you could sense everyone involved that was around that night, that was watching it in any way, you feel that sort of osmosis travel around the crew of people thinking they were seeing something special, and that was definitely one of them.
I think it's a solid choice, and I feel like that will be the same answer to my next question of what was your favorite scene to shoot.
Well, so towards the end of Legends, we went to Morocco for 3 weeks and shot all the foreign filming there, and that was really amazing. I mean, I think for me, Bob Servant, the first television I shot quite a long time ago now, I still remember that pure magicalism of it, of walking to a TV set in Dundee, where I'm from, and thinking, I can't believe this is happening. I can't believe that something I came up with and wrote House is about to be turned into a TV show by all these brilliant people. And, quite a few years down the line, being more experienced, stroke perhaps jaded, sometimes the production thing can start to wear you down in some ways, just exhaustion. Everyone's working so hard. But where I get that magical feeling back is foreign filming. That's where I still have that sense of being picked up from a hotel in some exotic foreign country and driven to the set, and there you're driving through the souk in Marrakesh and thinking, I can't believe that I'm going to film some of this story that I wrote back home in Northern Africa. And then particularly the last week or two, we ended up in the mountains, and that was just amazing. It was sort of these incredible sceneries and backdrops. But I think the Marrakesh, particularly because it just felt so different and exciting, and you'd be filming and then you'd go outside to get some fresh air, and you're in the middle of a market in Morocco, and definitely got that sense back of how far you come from sitting in your office on the page. So the stuff over there was really, really powerful. And then I thought some of the, we shot some stuff down on the coast late on, where we were down at this, when they're all out at sea, and filming some lovely stuff with Douglas Hodge down in the water. It was a dialogue-free scene, but I just thought it felt really, we got very lucky with the light and the sunset and things. So you get these lovely moments within it that kind of feel very special and take you out the kind of day-to-day work of it.
I think it's quite a beautiful sort of answer in terms of like the idea of like being somewhere that felt so far away from like your desk, but then also from like a previous sort of time as well, because I guess as well, like when you're writing it, you kind of have a vision of it, but when you're actually there, you're shooting, and everybody's, especially if it's towards the end of the shoot where everybody's sort of in that full flow and ready to sort of shoot abroad as well. And it's probably quite exciting shooting abroad as well, because you're away from the home comforts, but you know that you've only got a certain amount of days to capture everything, and you need to sort of just nail it, really.
Well, the first week was central Marrakesh, and it was 45 degrees, and it was insane. I mean, we finished it, I think, at Acton on the Friday, and then started filming in Marrakesh on the Monday, and it was I just remember it being so hot. I mean, the first day of filming, we were in the back of this sort of cafe, and Tom Burke and Gerald Kidd, who plays Malonis, greatly enjoyed the fact that I basically had packed appallingly. I was so tired by that point in production. I think I turned up in like jeans, and it was ridiculous. I was so incredibly hot, in all sorts of trouble, as a Dundonian in 45 degrees. And I ended up having to go and get some clothes, just lighter clothes, from this market stall around the corner in Marrakesh. So Tom and Gerald still talk about the fact that they shot a take, came and talked to me when I was very sweaty but dressed fairly normally, And they went off and did another take. And when they turned around, I was wearing tribal dress behind the cameras because that's the only thing that this stall was selling. Sort of this linen long robe. So they greatly enjoyed that. And then, I mean, the thing about that as well is you obviously can't have fans running while the cameras are rolling. So we filmed a nightclub location in Marrakesh, and I think the crew that were involved that day still talk about filming that nightclub scene in Marrakesh. It's almost like a survivors group because there was a back airless room where we had the monitors, and I can't fully put into words quite how miserable it was in there, but we got through it one way or another.
I'm just picturing people being like, "Oh, Neil in his jeans, quite brave," and then all of a sudden, like, "Is that actually Neil? Was that a local? What's going on?"
Yeah. It was full on, but yeah, very, very, very exciting. And then the flight back from Marrakesh was just brilliant. It was I flew back in the same plane as a couple of crew and half a dozen of the actors. I remember it was me and Tom was there, Tom Burt, Tom Hughes, Johnny Harris, Gerald, I think Paris Benjamin, quite a few of us on the same flight and having a couple of drinks, and it just felt, God, what a moment that was. 19 weeks done, and having a cold beer on the plane was brilliant. So yeah, I mean they're full on undertakings, these shows. So it's such a relief when they go down well, because I think it's a reward for everyone's work. You know, every department on Legends worked so hard and well beyond what was expected of them. I think people believed in the scripts and believed in the story, and it's really exciting that I feel really pleased for all of them that Legends will hopefully be a strong credit to have on the record, and hopefully leads to some other work as well. Just, you know, the way the industry is now, you want good people to get work, and I think hopefully Legends at some level will help them do so.
Yeah, and I guess the sense of relief is one thing, because it's like shooting feels like a marathon. Even though you have a certain amount of hours per day, there's also a chance that you could go over, or stuff that you can't control, like the weather. But then also, it's a nice note as well that, like, because it's such a popular show and people can see everybody's work showcased, if it's from production design to costume, sound, music, to also actors as well. Yeah, it's really, it's an incredible showcase. And plus it's like the what's it called, period drama nature of it, which you sometimes forget about as well, because it feels so close to that time, even though it's probably like 30 plus years now, which is kind of scary.
Yeah, it's pretty depressing that the 90s, there's periods, because I kind of feel like it was last week at some level.
For my final question, is there anything that I might have missed in my questions that you want to mention, or is there anything that you would want to ask me?
Okay, let me have a think. I think the one thing I'd say about a show like Legends, if you know, with you being a sort of industry podcast, is the thing I've learned more and more with making these shows is how much each department impacts story and the value that they bring, you know. And very occasionally you have to recognize that in terms of just making sure as showrunner you're across everything, just in case for whatever reason a decision's been made that slightly conflicts with how you'd hope the story might be told. But far more positively, and certainly in the shows I've made, and certainly in Legends, was how rewarding it is when departments come to you with these just extra work and extra ideas they've put in that you think, oh, that's actually so valuable, and it really elevates that moment. You know, costume, hair and makeup, props, locations, obviously the camera crew, all the producers that are there, you know, Charlie and Amber and Rhiannon and Ben, all their kind of production team, and the directors, of course, who kind of marshal so much of it. It's you just really appreciate, and I think kind of it sounds like counterintuitive, but as a showrunner, being across everything, I think the biggest thing you then recognize is how independently valuable every department is, and how they need to be allowed to contribute in really exciting, creative ways. So it kind of forces you to really appreciate what everyone does in a production, if you like, and you get a new respect for that work and recognition of how valuable they are. So I kind of love it in lots of ways. Often it can be, you feel you've got 100 things to do a day, but when you have the costume department come to you and say, look, we've done a bit of research, this could be quite interesting. It's just really invigorating. Or here in makeup, who have got an idea for a look of a character that really nails. You think, oh God, that's exactly what I couldn't quite put it into words, but that's exactly who I think that character is, and it really helps. They might have an idea for scars or tattoos that's really interesting and just deepens the character. It's kind of incremental making television. I think sometimes it's about having those big fundamental ideas, but really you've kind of got them out of the way at the script stage. I think on a set, it's about the 100 small ideas that you have and other people have, and it's making sure that they're aligned. And when you put the work in and get all those little decisions right, and all those little decisions are aligned creatively, I think that's when you end up with something really special.
Yeah, and I think as well, like you allow different department heads and their crew to work their magic and add things in. And as you mentioned, like creatively, like there's something that's in your mind, but then somebody can translate it and do their work to show you it. Which I find is always like incredible, because you could picture one thing as somebody somehow nailed it without you actually writing it down. And sometimes words can't really justify there's not enough words to be able to explain the idea, because it's just sort of so unique and visual that it's difficult to pin down.
And the department I didn't mention was the design. The design legend is absolutely fantastic. And Tally Eccleston and the team, they put so much work into it. And that's the other thing. You turn up at a location and you think, oh, this is just exactly how this should look. But if they'd asked me how it should look, I wouldn't have been able to, I wouldn't be able to tell them or show them this. So it's people who have read the scripts in such a responsible way, and asked all the questions they think they needed to ask, and then gone off and made, the decisions that only they can make is really exciting and rewarding.
Yeah, and probably so nice as well that it's massive weight off your shoulders as well to worry about, and people are working. Neil, thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks very much for having me. Enjoyed that.
Legends are streaming now on Netflix. Go out and watch Neil and everybody's hard work on the show. Thank you again.
Thanks a lot. All the best. Cheers.
You take care. Bye-bye. Thank you for listening. Please subscribe, rate, and review this podcast.